from cancer to,
Oh, Bill, I
whatever.
gotta get that on record. What did you say? Gigi asked a good question
But
last night.
but
I thought
but
it was
but but
sorry.
what was going on with the OG, in my opinion, wasn't they didn't believe that Jesus could solve all your medical problems, but they didn't see alcoholism as a medical problem. They saw it as a willpower problem and a
Right.
lack of spirituality problem. That's
Weakness.
how they saw it. So
Weakness.
so when Wilson starts talking about the medical stuff that's absolutely essential to that it's it's some sort of medical condition, they're like, no, dude, you got this completely wrong. That's not what's going on here. So anyhow, I didn't want to. I almost sent you a long email. And I thought, God, I just don't have time to write a long email, so I'll talk to her today when we get on this meeting. So, but it was a great question because I've never thought about that before. I mean, you have a really great eye for like nuance of what's going on here, and like, well, do you mean this or do you mean that, and thank you for that. Really, really. I always get a little nervous when you've got a question, which is every time we open up the Q&A, because you have challenging and interesting questions, lady, and thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I'll tell you something funny. I was talking about in my first drink or my last drink where I thought, oh, it says in the big book I can step around to the nearest bar room and try some controlled drinking. And a guy who commented on that later in the same meeting, this was today, he said, "You're the first person I've ever met who took the big book literally."
We are very literal.
In my home group, there's a couple of famous incidents. We have a beginners group for people. It used to be 6 months. You were stuck in the beginners group, and now it's 3 months, and then another group 3 months. But somebody, it's like, I need to go out drinking. I should do that and try that. Guys have thrown money on the table and told them to head out. Just go. It's like serious tough love kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just going to we have a minute. I want to do this for a minute. We have 21 pages to get through, so we'll go through some meetings for you. Now, for those of you who like this kind of stuff, we just started doing a discussion right in the big book meeting on Sunday. So it's at 3 p.m. If anyone's into, we want to just cover what we kind of read today, and maybe definitely want to read the publication chapter tomorrow. So definitely want to read that because of the April 10th, 87 years. So we're definitely going to read that tomorrow, chapter 30 of this book. And Mr. Sherbrooke won't be with us, but it's going to be a discussion meeting. I don't think Jim is going to be here, so we won't have to keep the A history only, Jim. But we're going to have a discussion, and we can have a chat and stuff like just fellowship, and we're going to have right in the big book as the focal point, right? And Bill Sherbrooke is with us. You probably know this. He's going to be doing. He's on his YouTube channel, but we delight to have him back with us next week. He's going to do chapter 8. He's doing chapter by chapter through the big book, and he's on chapter 8, and you can get all those on his.
David, I'm looking forward to the Q&A after that one.
Nice one. Nice to hear that. Yes. Nice, Bill.
And I hope Gigi's there.
And Eamon's meeting, just to touch on that, because Eamon does a lot of services with good service. Eamon, just tell people what you have coming up.
Yeah, well, every Sunday afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we have a long-timer speaker meeting where all the speakers are over 40 years sober. And tomorrow we have John B. from Arlington, Virginia, who is 41 years sober, telling us his story of recovery. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eamon. And we're just going to say a version of the set-aside prayer, because some people like this. I like it as well. So we're using God, obviously, as whatever that simplifies. I'm going to say, God, please help me to set aside everything that I think I know with an open mind to grow in understanding and effectiveness. And we just put in an amen there. And we're thinking of the alcoholics who have yet to find the big book, let alone the writing the big book, The Creation of AA, and the family members. Thank you, everyone. So thank you for your attention. So we'd like to have the author with us, Bill Sherbrooke. Pleasure to have you here, Bill. And we've got Jim Worley with us out of A History Only. And we're going to help read along with those gentlemen. And tonight we're on chapter 12. It's titled The Alcoholic Foundation. And we jumped into August. And we're in the year is 1938. And as you know, yesterday was April 10th. That's when the book was published. And we're leading towards that because this book, Writing a Big Book, covers that period of the 80 months from Counting Noses up to when the publication of the book. So, Bill, here we go. I've got the opening bit, and it's over to me in full screen. Chapter 12, The Alcoholic Foundation, August 1938, and it's on 229 of Writing the Big Book. Bill Wilson had developed a passionate new focus for his fundraising efforts. Having successfully convinced John D. Rockefeller Jr., the richest man in the country, to contribute to their cause, he saw no reason why his next target shouldn't be Henry Ford, the second richest man. The revolutionary automaker's distaste for alcohol was even more notorious than that of the Rockefeller family, who were generally described as being quote-unquote dries. Henry Ford was a quote-unquote super dry. He was so adamant in his opposition to drinking that early in his career he formed a 50-man quote-unquote social department within the Ford Motor Company to intrusively, investigate the moral conduct of all his employees. This group was instructed to fire any man who was caught drinking, or even if he was found to have liquor in his home. Ford had been such a fervent supporter of prohibition that when the possibility of repeal loomed in 1931, he threatened, quote, "If booze ever comes back to the United States, I am through with manufacturing. I wouldn't be interested in putting automobiles into the hands of a generation soggy with drink," end quote.
Economic self-interest quickly overrode that ominous threat when repeal went into effect in December of 1933. But Ford's conviction that alcohol was one of the great evils afflicting Western civilization was a foundational belief throughout his life.
Bill tries to reach Henry Ford through Charles Parcells.
Here was someone who would surely be more than willing to offer significant financial help to their new movement, if only Bill could find the proper way to approach him. Wilson's brother-in-law had been the key to meeting Willard Richardson and then accessing Rockefeller, but how could Bill go about securing a similarly impressive introduction to Henry Ford? After some careful thought, Wilson decided Charles Parcells, one of his Detroit business acquaintances, might be just the man to help. He wrote Parcells a 4-page letter on August 1st, 1938, presenting a detailed summary of the current state of affairs within Alcoholics Anonymous, while simultaneously asking for his advice on the best way to approach Ford. Parcells was a successful businessman, the principal in a Detroit brokerage firm that bore his name, and during the years 1946 and 47, he would serve as president of the Detroit Stock Exchange. Bill hadn't seen Charles for almost a year. Parenthesis, he mentions in passing the quote-unquote unpleasantness of last fall, which likely refers to him losing his job at Quar & Foley the previous October, close parenthesis. But he confidentially announced that he was since come right side up, and he had even been, quote, made a director of the Pierce Governor Company, end quote, a company that, quote, shows a lot of promise, end quote. So much promise, Bill says, that he would, quote, would like to talk at length with you about it when next I get out there.
But news of a wonderful new stock opportunity was not the purpose of the letter. Wilson notes that the last time they met, Parcells had been so interested in his work with alcoholics, quote, that I feel you would like to know what has happened. Moreover, I think that you can possibly be of a great deal of help to us in Detroit, close quote. Bill then spends a full page telling him about their growing success, 100 recoveries, 70 in Akron and 30 in New York out of the 200 attempts, of their plans to write a book and about the fabulous endorsements they have just secured from a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins, along with several other prominent professionals. Bill suggests Parcells could get an excellent picture of the current state of the work by just reading the 2 chapters and the outline he has enclosed in the mailing, carefully pointing out that, quote, although our material has to have a great deal of emotional pep, you will notice that the religious angle is presented in a very broad and sane manner, close quote, and that, quote, we have acquired a great deal of medical and psychiatric information about ourselves, close quote, that is also included in these chapters as an important part of the overall picture. Specifically distancing himself from the Oxford group, parentheses, which he was much more deeply involved with when the 2 men had last spoken of these matters, close parentheses, Bill pointedly notes that, quote, some of their religious thoughts have come from the so-called Oxford group, although the group got these mostly from the Lord's Prayer and the Sermon on the Mount, close quote, and that his own group has subsequently drawn on, quote, many other sources, selecting those ideas and attitudes which experience has shown are more useful, close quote. Moreover, they have realized it is, quote, quite important, even imperative, that we do not align ourselves with any particular institution or denomination, close quote. He then underlines this point by saying, quote, as it now stands, our religious presentation is so broad that a Catholic, a Jew, and an agnostic, or even a Hottentot can go for it. And they were, quote, most anxious to keep it that way, end quote.
This is a revealing statement for Bill to be making in early August of 1938, one clearly showing how far he had come in his understanding of the religious component of sobriety since he had last spoken with Charles Parcells in mid-1937.
Finally, Bill comes to the point noting, quote, as much as I dislike to introduce the money element into this picture, I don't see how it can be avoided, close quote. After explaining why money is needed at this time, he immediately gets specific and says they would be able to, quote, use at least $25,000 to excellent advantage over the next 12 months to carry on the general work and to get the book out, quote, end quote. Then just as quickly, Bill allays any fears Parcells might have that he was about to ask him for a donation by saying that they have already formulated a plan for raising the money, and what he really wants from Charles are his comments and suggestions on this plan. If he could just write back to Bill with his honest opinion on these matters, that would be, quote, would be plenty of contribution as far as we are concerned, close quote.
Bill Wilson had already described this proposed plan to others, but here it is laid out in greater detail. They are going to begin by approaching large corporations as a source of funding for their group. It is self-evident and logical that these companies would have a vested interest in reclaiming their fallen executives, and the expense of doing so is almost nothing when compared to what they now typically spend to discover some new industrial product or process.
Quote, for a corporation or its officers personally to foster this sort of effort would not only be humanitarian, it should be good for business. We are therefore about to approach the heads of big business in this country with the idea that we can be helpful to them and that they can be helpful to us if they so desire, close quote.
After 2.5 pages of prelude, Bill finally gets to the real purpose of the letter by stating categorically that
Henry Ford is on our list
of potential donors, telling Parcells that is exactly where Wilson hopes that he can be a great deal of help to us in Detroit. He then refers Parcells to the attached letter of recommendations, one from Albert Scott, parenthesis, a friend of Mr. John D. Rockefeller, end quote, and close parenthesis, and two from prominent doctors. Bill states confidentially that he has
no.
no doubt these letters.
He has no doubt these letters are strong enough so that we could see anyone in this country without further introduction, close quote.
Except perhaps Henry Ford.
Quote, I do think, however, that in Mr. Ford's case, a word of recommendation from somebody in Detroit would be helpful. Perhaps you are the man if you want to be, or you may know somebody who would be willing to do so, close quote.
Immediately reinforcing this built-in excuse for not getting involved, Bill tells Charles he is not,
quote, going to feel badly if you conclude that you had rather not be concerned with this thing,
and mentions two other avenues of approaching Ford he has already considered. The first of these was still an open option.
Quote, it may be that we should see Mr. Ford's publicity man, Mr. Cameron, first about these things. I frankly don't know and would like to have you tell me what you really think about that, close quote.
The second option was one of Bill's had already dismissed.
Quote, Dr. Sladen came to my mind, but I rejected the idea as he is definitely associated with the Oxford group, and he might therefore carry the idea of Mr. Ford to Mr. Ford that this is an Oxford group matter, which it definitely is not, close quote.
Dr. Frank J. Sladen had been physician-in-chief at Detroit General Hospital since 1914 when Henry Ford took over the financial responsibility for the hospital and embarked on his plans to make it a rival of Johns Hopkins in both power and prestige. In his conclusion, Wilson tells Parcells that whatever the case, he would appreciate it if he could
Please look over the enclosed material and let me know what you think ought to be done about it in Detroit.
We have no record of Charles Parcells' response, but over the next several months, Bill Wilson, in his typically tenacious fashion, would relentlessly continue his efforts to make direct contact with Henry Ford through whatever avenues he could find. Besides a later unsuccessful attempt by Charles Towns to provide an introduction to Ford, Bill and the recently sober Archie Trowbridge visited with Dr. Sladen and Dr. Dwight C. Ensign, an intern specializing in addiction, at Detroit General Hospital in early March of 1939. That visit seems to have made a favorable impression on both of these important doctors, but it did nothing to get Bill any closer to the great man himself. But none of these efforts ever produced the all-important face-to-face meeting with the great automobile maker or the result that Bill so desperately wanted, a ringing endorsement from Henry Ford, along with a generous contribution as a concrete expression of his commitment to their new method for staying sober.
Bill seeks Dr. Bob's support.
Henry Ford wasn't the only person Bill Wilson was aggressively pursuing during those early days of August. The other major target was Dr. Bob Smith, whose support he needed to ensure that the Akron group didn't wander off on some completely divergent path of its own. At this critical juncture, Wilson realized just how crucial it was that everyone be moving in the same general direction, and he was committed to doing everything in his power to make sure that happened. It was the only way to prevent the movement from coming apart at the seams and flying off into several different rival factions.
Fundraising for a foundation.
Dr. Bob was still hopeful that an alcoholic hospital could be opened in Akron under his leadership, but that would only happen if money could be found to fund it. So although he was still locally silent on the matter of money, Bob was firmly committed to Bill's fundraising efforts. In a long letter to him in late June, Bill had asked, "What would you think about the formation of a charitable corporation to be called, let us say, Alcoholics Anonymous? Money coming in from the book could be handled through it, as well as any funds arising from contributions by corporations who benefited by our work. We should always remember that perhaps someday our activities will be scrutinized by hostile microscopes with the idea of proving we are a racket. If we now form a corporation whose control is exercised by a board composed largely of disinterested and non-alcoholic people, we shall have closed the door to such criticism. The trustees of this corporation could administer any other enterprises we might want to engage in, such, for instance, as sanitariums." Wilson's inclusion of the word, quote-unquote, sanitariums here is hardly subtle, but it underlines the very real possibility that they would be establishing an alcoholics-only recovery facility in Akron just as soon as the money became available. And when that happy day did come, all the wonderful work Dr. Bob Smith was presently doing with alcoholics could then be performed in a first-rate facility with adequate medical and spiritual resources, along with, best of all, a regular paycheck for the director. 3 weeks later, in Bill's July 15th letter to Bob, he makes no mention of the possibility of setting up a foundation, although he did tell him about their plan, quote, to put the bite, end quote, on several very rich and prominent men over the next few weeks. These fundraising activities, he said, made it impossible to predict when he might be coming to Akron again. But even without a visit to Ohio, the two men did manage to have a detailed discussion during the next 2 weeks, parentheses, via either telephone or unsaved correspondence, about the creation of a foundation, discussions that resulted in Dr. Smith agreeing to serve as one of the trustees of the new Alcoholic Foundation. This must have pleased Bill immensely. Not only did his acceptance of this public position more firmly cement Smith's commitment to the ambitious New York plans. It also allowed them to add his name to their masthead, immediately bringing a much-needed tone of professionalism and respectability to the foundation.
Getting the Akron squad's stories for the book. But establishing a foundation wasn't the only thing they discussed during those late July talks. Wilson was anxious to get the Ohio members committed to his vision for AA, and he thought the best way to do that was to get them actively involved in the book project. He wanted Smith to be much more aggressive and insist that the Akron quote-unquote alcoholic squad start writing their own stories for the proposed book. Bill had already sent him a copy of Hank's list of the professions and the obvious corresponding members, the majority of whom were in Akron, that he wanted to include in the stories section. So how were those stories progressing, and how soon could he expect to see some finished copies of those stories coming in from Ohio? Whatever the substance of their earlier discussions, Bob had some questions about exactly what Bill was looking for, and he wrote back asking for clarification. Smith's letter has been lost, but Wilson's reply on the 7th of August supplies some candid advice on how the Ohio members should go about writing their personal stories.
Dear Bob, thanks for your good letter. About the stories, I should say that everyone should write at whatever length they want to. The more the better. Then 1,000-word manuscripts can be edited down to the right size. The idea is that a chance word or phrase or experience may be the most telling point of the story, which would be missed entirely if people were trying to restrict themselves to a given number of words. Enclosed herewith are 3 letters vouching for us, and I'm enclosing enough copies so that they can be attached to the 4 manuscripts you have. We are now laying the pipes to Owen D. Young, Henry Ford, and Thomas Lamont. What is going to happen, of course, remains yet to be seen. Very much yours.
It's interesting to note Bob's question was not in relation to the longer 5,000-word stories written by the most sober men. Wilson had already provided copious details of these in an earlier letter, and he had also supplied his own story as a model for how these might be written, but about the shorter versions he was hoping to get from more recent members. Bill justifies his suggestion that everybody, quote, should write at whatever length they want, end quote, by casually noting these free-form stories would be edited down to the proper length once the book got closer to its final assembly. Unspoken, but clearly implied here, is that those final editing decisions would be made by the people in New York. But the most unexpected revelation of this letter is Bill's enclosure of copies of 3 letters vouching for their group, which should, quote, be attached to the 4 manuscripts you have, end quote. The previous October, the Ohio members had been emphatic that there would be no fundraising done in Akron. If Bill wanted to raise money for his overly ambitious and moneyed schemes, they said, then he could just go back to New York and look for donors there. The quote-unquote alcoholic squad in Ohio would have nothing to do with it. But remarkably, at this point in August 1938, Bill obviously expects Dr. Bob Smith to take those 4 manuscripts and use them locally to solicit donations for the Alcoholic Foundation. There's just no other plausible explanation by why he would send Bob these recommendation letters. Admittedly, New York was then the richest city in the country, but Akron had more than its fair share of millionaires. Most prominent among these was Harvey Firestone, who was not only a committed member of the Oxford Group, but also a man with a strong and vested interest in promoting sobriety. Bill may have convinced Dr. Bob that Firestone would be an excellent prospective donor for their group, or perhaps, since he was surely aware of the famously close friendship between Harvey Firestone and Henry Ford, he was hoping that by making a good impression on Firestone, their group might thereby gain a favorable and powerful introduction to Ford.
Setting up the foundation.
Sorry. All the months of talk and speculation about setting up a tax-exempt foundation finally came to fruition on Friday, August 5th, when the necessary paperwork was finally ready to be signed. One major reason for the delay was the significant legal costs of setting up such a foundation. money the leaders of AA clearly did not have, as they struggled to make ends meet on a day-to-day basis. The problem was solved when Frank Amos enlisted the services of a young lawyer named John Wood, who agreed to draw up the necessary paperwork pro bono. This was quite a coup for Amos, since Wood was a rising star in Root, Clark, Buckner, and Ballantine, one of the most important and prestigious law firms in New York City, and his services would have been prohibitively expensive otherwise. John Wood was also, according to Amos, motivated by his, quote, knowledge of this movement and his sympathy for it, close quote, and was so committed that he not only drew up the necessary documents, but even agreed to serve as one of the first 5 trustees of the new Alcoholic Foundation. Having taken on the assignment, Wood's job is almost immediately complicated by what Bill Wilson later called, quote, a legal riddle, close quote. The foundation was to be set up in such a way that the decision-making powers would always rest with a majority of non-alcoholics rather than with the alcoholic trustees. Wood spent considerable time trying to create a pair of definitions that would legally differentiate between those who had never had a problem with alcohol and those who were sober ex-drinkers. But he never found a way to resolve that thorny dilemma. While this was an incredibly frustrating challenge for the young lawyer, it only amused members of the regular Tuesday night meeting in Brooklyn, one of whom reportedly quipped, quote, well, that's a cinch. A non-alcoholic guy is a guy who can drink, and an alcoholic is a guy who can't drink. Close quote.
Unfortunately, John Wood needed something more legally specific than this to resolve his problem. If neither Bill Wilson nor Hank Parkhurst, 2 men with years of experience with alcoholics and alcoholism, could come up with a short but conclusive definition for the alcoholic, then how could they possibly expect this young non-alcoholic lawyer to resolve the issue for them in just a few short weeks? In fact, Wood never did discover a solution to his problem, but like any good lawyer, he did find a way to work around it. According to Wilson, he, quote, finally gave up his attempt to describe an alcoholic in legal terms, close quote, and suggested that they could sidestep the whole problem by just writing up and signing a simple trust agreement rather than applying for a formalized charter for the foundation. And that is exactly what Wood did. He created a 13-page trust indenture, which placed control of the Alcoholic Foundation in the hands of 5 trustees. These trustees were to be
divided into 2 classes, to be known respectively as Class A and Class B. Trustees in Class A are intended to be persons who are not and have not been alcoholics. Trustees in Class B are intended to be persons who have been alcoholics. The purpose of the division of the trustees into such classes is to provide for representation of alcoholics among the trustees and, at the same time, to ensure that the majority of the trustees at all times will be persons who are not and have not been alcoholics.
Having successfully dodged the problematic issue of defining exactly who was and who wasn't an alcoholic with this simple statement of fact, Wood then went on to note that, quote, if any Class B trustee is found to have consumed any alcohol beverage after his election to the office, it shall be the mandatory duty of the other trustees to remove him at once, unquote. Well, at least that was clear enough. The duties of the trustees would include ensuring that the money collected by the Alcoholic Foundation was put to the proper purposes. And here it becomes clear the ambitious plans Wilson had formulated for his group the previous October, a string of hospitals, paid missionaries, and a book, was still very much a part of his ongoing plans, with a few new items added along the way just for good measure.
The purposes. The purposes of the foundation to which the fund is to be applied by the trustees are 1. The relief and rehabilitation of persons suffering from or threatened with alcoholism and its attendant problems by conducting or participating in or giving financial or other assistance to any of the following activities. A. personal work of a religious but non-sectarian nature among alcoholics. B, the maintenance of places of rest and recuperation for alcoholics. C, providing financial assistance in the form of loans or gifts of alcoholics. D, research in the field of alcoholism and related problems. E, the publication and distribution of books, pamphlets, and other literature on the subject of alcoholism or designed to assist alcoholics in overcoming their difficulties. Point 2, the making of gifts of money or property to other charitable or religious organizations having the same or similar purposes, no part of the net earnings of which inure to the benefit of any private stockholder or individual, and no substantial part of the activities of which is carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation. And point number 3, any and all activities which, in the judgment of the trustees, will assist in the restoration of alcoholics to normal life.
As Bill said years later, they thought the Alcoholic Foundation, quote, ought to be chartered to do just about anything within the field of alcoholism except lobby for prohibition, close quote. And that's exactly what John Wood empowered the foundation to do. After defining the election in terms of the trustees, articulating what powers they did and did not have in relation to money, and describing the administrative offices of the foundation and their individual responsibilities, the indenture went on to create an advisory board that would, quote, consult and advise with the trustees with regard to carrying out the purposes of the foundation. The functions of the advisory board, however, shall be merely those of consultation and advice, and the trustees shall retain the full powers and responsibilities of their office, close quote. The first 3 Class A trustees were John Wood, Frank Amos, and Willard Richardson. The 2 Class B trustees were Bill Riddell, parentheses, the man who had accompanied Bill Wilson to Akron the previous October, close parentheses, and Dr. Bob Smith. Both Bill Wilson and Hank Parkhurst were elected to the advisory board, along with Albert Scott and A. Leroy Chipman.
It's interesting to note the strong similarities and also some significant differences between the structure of the new Alcoholic Foundation and the way John D. Rockefeller Jr. had set up his own Committee on Benevolence so many years earlier. Rockefeller's Benevolence Committee had a number of honorary members on its board of directors, as are Wood and Smith here, but the real decision-making powers rested squarely with his advisory committee, whose powerful executive director was Willard Richardson, which is not the case here. The Alcoholic Foundation made no official distinction among the 4 members of the advisory board, and no single member was designated as its executive director. Still, even in this reduced capacity, the advisory board would function as the center of action within the Alcoholic Foundation. Under this model, Dr. Bob's presence as one of the trustees is a position that fully acknowledged his commitment to the project of raising and spending money, while simultaneously recognizing that the 450 miles separating him from New York City would prevent him from being any kind of force in the day-to-day decision-making process. Wilson and Parkhurst would be the primary channels for the information presented to the trustees, and they would therefore be in the position of having the most influence over any decision the trustees might make.
The initial meetings of the foundation.
The paperwork was dated and delivered on Friday, August 5th, and it wasn't until the following Thursday, August 11th, that the first meeting of the Alcoholic Foundation was actually held. The delay was necessary because Dr. Bob Smith would not be coming to New York City for the meeting, so the documents had to be mailed to him for his signature and official notarization. Each of the other 4 trustees had their copies signed and notarized on August 5th, but Smith signed copies of the indenture trust, parentheses, which was notarized on the 10th, closed parentheses, along with his handwritten proxy letter authorizing Willard Richardson to vote in his stead, did not arrive in New York until August 11th, parentheses. In fact, Dr. Bob Smith was unable to attend any of the official trustee meetings during the critical 1938 period, close
first-
parentheses.
The first meeting.
Okay. With everything in hand, Amos, Richardson, and Riddell, parentheses, John Wood was absent, close parentheses, met in room 5600 at Rockefeller Center. Dr. Bob's proxy, quote, I hereby appoint Mr. W.S. Richardson to represent me at the meeting of the trustees of the Alcoholic Foundation and to vote for me as he sees fit. I instruct him, however, to vote for Mr. Frank B. Amos for treasurer of said foundation, close quote, was duly read and accepted within just a few minutes. Bill Riddell was elected as permanent chairman of the Alcoholic Foundation, and Frank Amos became its temporary secretary and the permanent treasurer. The two remaining Rockefeller men, Chipman and Scott, were then elected to the foundation's advisory board, parentheses, thereby cementing the commitment of all four of Rockefeller's friends to this new foundation, close parentheses, along with Bill Wilson and Hank Parkhurst. Two of these new members, Chipman and Parkhurst, were present at the meeting. Albert Scott and Bill Wilson were not. Having taken care of the administrative formalities, Hank Parkhurst was then called upon, quote, to recount the work to date in the Eastern section, close quote, and he delivered a report noting that
41 alcoholics have recovered and are currently, quote unquote, on the ball. We have 6 alcoholics in the questionable class, 12 alcoholics upon whom a great deal of time has been spent, but who are so difficult that the cases are classified as practically hopeless. 10 alcoholics who have definitely recovered, but who are out of touch with the group. At present, they have over 25 prospects.
since the Ohio contingent was at this time commonly referred to as being in a, quote, western city and its environs, close quote, these figures represent the current status of recovery in New York, New Jersey, and Washington. If there had really been just 10 sober members the previous October, and if Hank's August numbers are accurate, there would have been a solid 4-fold increase, parentheses, or 5-fold if we're meant to include those out-of-touch members with the 41 who have recovered, close parentheses, in the number of sober members in the East since Bill and Dr. Bob had, quote-unquote, counted noses in Akron. While Hank had suggested to Amos in mid-March that neither he nor Bill nor Fitz should be, quote, called upon to make reports or be pressed to show results, close quote, this kind of growth in just 10 months was certainly the kind of report Parkhurst was anxious to make. Such impressive numbers lent solid credibility to the desperate need for money so they could continue this obviously effective work of saving alcoholics. Regarding those needed contributions, Hank concluded his presentation by providing some details on, quote, Mr. Wilson's and his own activities toward raising funds for the foundation, close quote. Although the minutes are not explicit, beside the contribution from Rockefeller in March, Hank likely reported on the monies they had already received from Charles Towns and the $1,000 Bill had managed to borrow from Agnes Mayo. Beyond that, we can safely assume Hank then painted a glowing picture of their current plans for approaching some of the richest men in the country, including Owen Young, Thomas Lamont, Alfred Sloan, Edward Stettinius, and Henry Ford. In his new role as treasurer, Amos then, quote, went into budget and office matters for the information of the trustees, close quote, producing the necessary paperwork to be signed by 3 of them so that an, quote, unincorporated association account, close quote, could be opened at a local bank for the future management of the foundation's money. And so on that high note, and with great hopes for the future, the first formal meeting of the Alcoholic Foundation, parentheses, which would later evolve into the General Service Office of Alcoholics Anonymous, close parentheses, was unanimously adjourned.
Why Bill Wilson did not attend this important meeting is something of a mystery and completely unexpected at such a critical juncture for the group. The reason for his absence is neither noted in the minutes nor mentioned in Lois's diaries or in any other contemporary document. The meeting was called at the last minute on the same day Bob Smith signed copies of the trust indenture and his proxy letter arrived. So perhaps Bill had a prior commitment to meet with some rich or well-connected New Yorker on that day when he just couldn't afford to cancel. But whatever the explanation, Bill's absence definitely provided Hank Parkhurst with an opportunity to take center stage and proudly recount for the trustees all of their current successes in the East.
The second meeting.
It's also interesting to note that neither Wilson nor Parkhurst attended the second meeting of the Alcoholic Foundation, which was held just 7 days later on Thursday, August 18th. We know Bill had left for Maryland the previous Saturday, parenthesis, chasing the possibility of opening a sanitarium for alcoholics in Washington, D.C., close parenthesis, but the reason for Hank's absence and his exact whereabouts on that day are uncertain. This second meeting was attended by Richardson, Amos, and Rudell, along with A. Leroy Chipman, who was sitting in as a representative for the advisory committee. Other than reading and accepting the minutes from the previous meeting and the treasurer's report with the particulars of the new bank account he would be opening the next day, the entire agenda was devoted to the transfer of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s contribution from the Alcoholic Fund to the new Alcoholic Foundation. For some reason, this involved quote-unquote considerable discussion before the three men unanimously agreed to transfer the $2,150 still remaining from, quote, an anonymous donor for the alcoholic work being done in Akron, Ohio, end quote, into the foundation's new account. It is more than likely that this prolonged discussion centered on the fact that the money could only be transferred with, quote, the stipulation that it be used exclusively for the work in Akron, end quote, making it explicit that the money could not be spent on for any other purpose than that stated in the organization charter. Having approved the transfer with that restriction, the trustees then authorized Frank Amos to send Dr. Bob Smith a check for $200 on the first of each month, starting in September and continuing until the following April. The next day, Frank Amos was still busy with foundation work. He wrote Willard Richardson, informing him he had just returned from the bank, where he closed the joint account they had maintained for the Alcoholic Fund and transferred the remaining balance into the new account established for, quote, the Alcoholic Foundation, which came into existence on August 11th, 1938, end quote. Frank also wanted to bring his report of receipts and disbursements up to date, and he did so by noting that there had been no new contributions since the last accounting and that he had written just one check for $200, which was mailed to Dr. Bob Smith on August 1st.
Frank Amos writes a history of the foundation.
After spending some considerable time with Frank Amos in Akron the previous February, Bob Smith had characterized him as, quote, a very shrewd man and a very careful and thorough diagnostician, close quote. And it was exactly these qualities which prompted Amos to spend the rest of that Friday afternoon dictating and proofing an 8-page document he entitled, quote, History of the Alcoholics Movement up to the formation of the Alcoholic Foundation on April 11th, 1938, close quote. Amos was profoundly aware that he was involved in the creation of something revolutionary and conscious of his position at the epicenter of this major historical event. He felt it was important to record the details of how the movement had become and been set in motion so that they would be properly preserved for posterity. Frank's history tells a detailed story about the December 1937 meeting at Rockefeller Center and the conference held among the 4 Rockefeller men immediately afterward, before going on to describe his trip to Akron and then recounting the concerns over money which led to the creation of the Alcoholic Foundation. Amos supplies a wealth of information in this document that appears nowhere else in the contemporary record, making it a valuable piece of writing for any comprehensive history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we must be grateful to Frank for his foresight and his commitment to getting all of these wonderful details down on paper. The following Monday, in the interest of historical accuracy, he took the additional step of asking both Hank and Bill to review and correct this document before it was finally typed.
570 Lexington Avenue, New York City, August the 22nd, 1938. Mr. Henry G. Parkhurst, 17 William Street, Newark, New Jersey. Dear Hank, it is my intention that the attached memorandum which Miss Dorr wrote for me to be placed in the permanent record of the Alcoholic Foundation, so that in future years anyone reading the minutes will know the history of the movement from the time that we four became interested in it. I would appreciate it if you would read it over very carefully. If you find anything wrong or if you have any suggestions of any kind for improving it, please let me know. I think Bill Wilson should also read it before it is finally typed. I have 2 or 3 intimate friends who are already fairly familiar with this work, to whom I want to give a copy of this, along with your prospectus of the book. And as soon as you and Bill have passed on it, it can be copied, and I should like to have about 6 copies, including the original. Sincerely yours, Frank B. Amos.
Despite the additional review by these 2 direct participants, there are still some misstatements in this account, parentheses, in particular with dating, close parentheses, but these are minor. Frank Amos's history did an outstanding job of presenting the backstory of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was largely missing from the outline and the 2 chapters included in the prospectus of the book. The document would therefore provide an excellent introduction to the work for his friends who, on the basis of their friendship alone, would likely have read all of these additional 8 pages. Beyond these few friends mentioned in his letter to Hank, it is unknown whether Bill and Hank ever included any of their extra copies of the Amos history in the promotional packages sent out to prospective donors after the middle of August. Frank Amos certainly felt it made a valuable addition to any appeal they might make to potential donors, and he obviously intended them to use it as such. From another perspective, it should also be noted that Amos's efforts amounted to nothing less than, quote unquote, the history of the work that Hank had insisted should be included in the first chapter of the book. It is even possible, especially considering Amos's request for Parkhurst's input, that Hank had encouraged Frank to write up this detailed account. But whatever the exact impetus for creating this valuable document, it is to both men's everlasting credit that it was written, reviewed, and then preserved for the historical record.
Judge Casey and the prospect of a DC sanitarium.
While the disappointingly small contribution from Rockefeller had ended any hope of Dr. Bob running an alcoholic hospital in Akron, Bill received a letter in early August that quickly developed into the possibility that they might be able to open their own sanitarium for drunks in Washington, D.C. in the very near future. This was such a solid and tempting opportunity that Bill Wilson lost most of the next month as he tried to turn his dream of founding this first of what was hoped to be many AA sanitariums into a reality. The exciting news came in a letter from Victor Heiser, the president of the National Association of Manufacturers, who told Bill, quote, "I thought perhaps it might be of interest to you to know that Judge Walter J. Casey of the Police Court of the District of Columbia has expressed interest in the town's treatment for alcoholism and drug addiction. It would probably be advised for you to get in touch with him," end quote. Perhaps this might be of interest? Wilson was, of course, very interested and elated by the news. This was exactly what he'd hoped would start to happen with increasing regularity. As people became more familiar with their work, they would begin to talk about the amazing success rate of Alcoholics Anonymous, and this would lead to a growing number of personal recommendations just like this one. Bill's vision of how they would network to reach more and more potential donors was finally beginning to work. Wilson had been introduced to Heiser by, quote, one of Mr. Rockefeller's associates, end quote, likely Willard Richardson, and they had met sometime earlier, probably during the third week of July, but Bill had been disappointed by that meeting. Quote, it seemed at the time as though he had little interest in, quote, he told Fitz when writing him with the news of this judge in Washington. Quote, but apparently he took fire to some extent, end quote, passing their promotional package along to other interested parties and eventually catching the attention of Judge Walter Casey. Bill wrote back to Heiser a few days later, thanking him for the referral and noting,
it so happens that one of our most active men lives near Washington, and I have asked him to call upon Judge Casey. I think you will be interested in the enclosed letter, which I did not have with me the other day, from the chief physician of Towns Hospital. Please let me know of any case of alcoholism where you think our group might be helpful. And please also forgive my tardiness in acknowledging the very pleasant interview I had with you.
Finally, they had a solid lead and a possible job for Fitz Mayo, one that was right in his own backyard. On Monday, August 8th, Bill wrote Fitz enclosing a copy of Heiser's letter and gently suggested, quote, perhaps you will want to call on Judge Casey, end quote. Fitz didn't need much in the way of encouragement, and he managed to get an appointment with the judge that very week. According to Bill, Judge Walter J. Casey was, quote, a most public-spirited man, end quote, and, quote, very influential in the District of Columbia, end quote. In addition, he had a fair degree of notoriety as a no-nonsense judge, not only in Washington, but also nationally. Just 2 years earlier, he had famously jailed a sitting U.S. congressman who had publicly declared Casey could, quote unquote, go to hell after the judge issued a warrant for his arrest. A year later, the judge gained even more national attention when his picture appeared in a Life magazine article describing how he had sentenced a woman to a year in jail for child beating. Parenthesis, years later, Judge Casey also showed up in the May 1947 issue of the AA Grapevine, which quoted extensively from a paper he had written entitled, quote, A Judge's View of Alcoholism. Given his job of presiding over the local police court, it is not surprising that the judge had, quote, dealt extensively with drunks in his court, and had wondered for years what could be done about it, end quote. Bill Wilson was confident he had a definite answer to the judge's question of what could be done about it, and Casey's influence would provide them with the opportunity to establish the first official AA sanitarium in Washington, which, quote, could easily be the starting point for other model setups of this same kind, end quote. In the beginning, everything looked extremely positive. During Fitz's first meeting with Casey, the judge, quote, took fire right away and wanted to know what we proposed, end quote. That was all Fitz Mayo needed to hear. He immediately telephoned Brooklyn, and Bill Wilson caught the next train south to Washington, D.C., where he stayed for the next 10 days. During that week and a half, he and Fitz made several calls on the judge, which they, quote, suggested that enough funds ought to be raised by private subscription to rent a house in Washington this winter and open a farm on the outskirts next spring, end quote. Their plan was to accept, quote unquote, selected cases only in order to build up a, quote, strong team down in that district, end quote. Once presented with this proposal, Casey grew even more enthusiastic and claimed, quote, there would be little difficulty in raising the money among his friends for such an experiment, end quote, with the ultimate plan being that, quote, if after a year trial the experiment proved successful, there would be no trouble in getting the district to make a larger contribution for a still larger effort, end quote. Finally, they were really getting somewhere. Casey was as good as his word discussing their proposal with, quote, some friends of his who included the chief commissioner of the District of Columbia, the president of the Washington Board of Trade, the head of the Elks, and some other prominent business people, end quote. After listening to the judge's presentation and reading over the 2 chapters of the book, several of these gentlemen suggested a meeting be organized where they could speak directly with the recovered alcoholics and then make a coordinated plan for their next step forward. While Bill claims the suggestion for this meeting came from Washington, the proposal so closely mirrors the successful meeting with the Rockefeller team the previous December that Wilson, parenthesis, or his glowing account of that dinner, close parenthesis, was likely the original source of this idea. But whoever formulated the plan, the organization of the meeting quickly floundered, and Bill's hope of repeating the Rockefeller Center success turned into a long, drawn-out affair that eventually spilled over into late September and then dragged on until November. Bill and Fitz came back to Brooklyn on August 23rd, arriving just in time to attend the Tuesday night meeting. Both men had several appointments with prospective donors that week in the city, where once again they encountered uncomprehending resistance and even pleas of poverty from other foundations. Fitz received one particularly heartfelt response from a Mr. Bulis, the executive director of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, claiming they were currently running an annual deficit of $20,000 and actively discouraging Mayo from contacting any of their regular donors. They needed the money themselves. The following Monday, August 29, Fitz was still in Brooklyn, and the judge had not yet been able to establish a date that worked for everyone. He wanted to attend this meeting. Fitz sent him a letter of encouragement, holding out the prospect that Dr. Bob might even be able to join them for the discussion in Washington.
Dear Judge Casey, when you have determined on the date for the meeting which you proposed, will you please notify Mr. W.G. Wilson at 182 Clinton Street, Brooklyn, New York, as much in advance as possible? We may be able to get a doctor who has been free from liquor for 3 years and who is head of a large group of ex-alcoholics in Akron, Ohio, to come on. This man has had quite a lot of experience, both from the spiritual and medical standpoint, with many cases. I imagine there will be about 6 of us present. Cordially yours, F. Mayo, JFM:RH. P.S. I expect to be at my home next Saturday, September the 3rd, in the event you can get your group together next week.
On that same day, Bill wrote a letter to Dr. Bob telling him all of the details of this recent development in Washington, parenthesis, which he knew would be, quote unquote, of exceptional interest, close parenthesis, and describing the, quote, definite proposal for that area, which would include some sort of community house in Washington this winter and next spring a farm on the outskirts, end quote. Finally, he informed Bob that it looked as if the meeting would be held, quote, shortly after Labor Day, say about the 7th or the 8th of September, end quote, and that
We think we ought to appear in Washington in some strength. It is probable that Fitz, Don McLean, Hank Parkhurst, yourself, and myself should be there if possible. We think you will be especially needed because you can tell the gentleman firsthand about the kind of experience you have had out there, because this is the sort of thing we will seek to develop in Washington and Baltimore. Though the exact date of the meeting is not set, I'm wondering if you can arrange to come to it in case it seems necessary at the time. And in the event we can provide you with the wherewithal, it isn't absolutely necessary that you come to the meeting, but it would certainly be helpful, we think.
Dr. Bob visits New York.
the August 29th date on the letter quoted above is problematic and probably wrong, because the very next day Bob Smith arrived in Brooklyn, and it's hard to understand why Bill would have bothered to write in such detail and ask so many questions if he knew that he would actually be speaking to Bob the following day. Dr. Bob and Smith and his wife Ann and their son Bob arrived at the Wilson house on Tuesday, August 30th, and stayed for 3 days. In all likelihood, they're on their way to Vermont to visit Bob's mother over the Labor Day weekend, and, as he had done the previous December, made this side trip to New York, and this time to catch up with Bill and to spend some time with the other members of the Eastern group.
Sorry, that mute button again. The two men had not seen each other since Wilson's last trip to Ohio the previous April, and he had written only 4 letters to Bob during those intervening 4 months. It would be helpful to have copies of any letters Bob may have written during this time. We know there was at least one, which Wilson references by saying, quote, "Thanks for your good letter," close quotes, but it did not survive. Still, there is no indication of any glaring gap in their correspondence during those 4 months, other than the necessary discussion about Bob Smith's election as a trustee of the Alcoholic Foundation, parenthetically, which, as already noted, might have been negotiated with a phone call, close parentheses. Such a minimal amount of communication over these critical 4 months severely challenges the popular AA myth regarding the close contact and constant interaction between these two men during this period.
The Smiths arrived just in time for Bob to participate in the regular Tuesday night meeting. But unfortunately, we have no record of what he thought about the very different style and substance of that meeting. By late August 1938, the format in Brooklyn had been evolving for well over a year and was now significantly different from the Oxford group meetings being held at T. Henry Williams' house from every Wednesday night in Akron. The New York meetings were not only far less religious in tone, but they also placed a much greater emphasis on alcohol, both the participants' past history with drinking and the importance of not picking up the first drink, which was not happening in the Ohio meetings. It would be fascinating to know just how approving and even comfortable Bob Smith felt when he came face to face with such glaring differences, but he has left us with no record of his reactions.
In addition, we have no information about what opinions, if any, Bob Smith may have expressed about the recently launched book project, and especially about the 2 chapters Bill had mailed him 2 months earlier. Did he approve or disapprove of the overall plan? Should they make changes to the outline? What did he really think about those 2 chapters? Did he offer any criticisms or suggestions at all? In addition, what kind of progress has been made or not made in Akron on the stories needed for the book? And if he hadn't already sent it to Bill, did Bob perhaps show up in Brooklyn with a draft of his own story for the book? If nothing else, Bill Wilson was surely curious to know if the book project had gathered any recent support among those Ohio members who had been so vocal in their condemnation of the idea just 4 months earlier. Did Bob have anything to say about any of these issues?
There were also those still very contentious issues surrounding money and hospitals. It would be invaluable to know the substance of any conversations they might have had about their ongoing fundraising efforts and the role of the newly created Alcoholic Foundation, along with the strong possibility they might imminently be opening the first AA sanitarium in Washington, D.C. And finally, there was the very real possibility that they would soon be receiving some prominent national publicity, since that August 30th meeting was also attended by an observer from the Reader's Digest who had been invited to sit in by Hank Parkhurst in the hopes that the Digest would write a favourable article about the success of their movement.
This was, after all, the only time during the year 1938 that Bill Wilson, Hank Parkhurst, Fitz Mayo, and Bob Smith, the 4 most important and active members of early Alcoholics Anonymous, ever had a chance to sit down together and have a meaningful discussion about the future of their movement. Bob's and Fitz's presence in New York allowed for nothing less than a summit meeting of AA. And yet we know absolutely nothing about what they talked about, what opinions might have been offered, or what plans may have been formulated regarding these pressing issues.
Despite the likelihood that interesting and even important things were discussed during Dr. Bob's 3-day trip to New York, the only answer we have regarding this host of intriguing questions comes in a letter Bill wrote to Bob a week after he left Brooklyn. Quote, "It was certainly great to have you folks with us," end quote. That is all the contemporary information we have about what happened during those 3 days. Perhaps the insistence that these important issues must have been addressed during those 3 days is just our wish that they had been discussed and the details preserved so that we could have a better understanding of the personalities and the dynamics of Alcoholics Anonymous's early history. Instead, it may have been that the only thing happening during this visit was that Bill and Bob, along with Hank and Fitz, sat around in grateful wonderment over how radically different their lives were now that they had found a way to stop drinking and how happy they were just to be sober. While it would not be completely surprising for alcoholics to focus so exclusively on themselves for 3 days, it remains likely that none of these important topics were discussed during this singular visit. What is surprising is that nothing of importance or value seems to have come out of those talks with Dr. Bob Smith. A week earlier, Bill Wilson had noted, quote, the old juggernaut bounces along, end quote, and it had apparently continued to bounce along in exactly the same direction and in exactly the same way that it had already been going without any meaningful input for change from Dr. Robert H. Smith.
The DC sanitarium experiment fails.
Unfortunately, the early September dates Bill had first mentioned to Bob for the meeting in Washington did not work out. And on September 8th, he wrote again asking Bob to reserve the following week as a possible date for the meeting. Quote, Fitz has seen Judge Casey again in Washington, and it looks as though the Washington meeting would take place Thursday or Friday of next week, which will be the 15th or 16th. I'm not positive of the exact date, but we'll let you know the minute we find out. On that same day, Bill wrote a letter to Don McLean, the sober police court judge who lived just north of Albany and who was almost certainly one of the 10 members Hank had reported at the First Foundation meeting as being recovered, but out of touch with the group, asking him if he would join them for this important meeting in Washington. Quote, like yourself, Judge Casey has dealt extensively with drunks in his court and has wondered for years what could be done about it. Our observation of the judge tells us that you and he are bound to click. So we all very much hope that you can be there on September 15th or 16th. Bob Smith is coming in from Akron, and Hank, Bill Riddell, and myself will go from New York. Perhaps we can arrange to drive from here down together. I think Fitz has enough room to put us up, so there should be little expense.
Bill Wilson was all business as he did everything in his power to prepare the grounds for this critical meeting, mailing Fitz a copy of Frank Amos's quote-unquote history and suggesting, quote, perhaps Judge Casey ought to read it before the meeting, end quote, and then asking Mayo if there was any, quote, prospect of getting the Baltimore, that is John Hopkins, contingent for the Washington meeting, end quote. Everything that could be done was being done to make this as successful as, if not more successful than, the first meeting with the Rockefeller team 8 months earlier.
Then, although Bill Wilson was reluctant to admit it, the whole enterprise began to slowly unravel. Near the end of September, Bill finally wrote Dr. Bob a letter confessing, quote, I shouldn't have kept you in suspense about the Washington situation. It turns out that Judge Casey is in the hospital after an operation. The matter stands just where it did before, but it looks as though he would be unable to do anything about it for 3 or 4 weeks. We'll let you know when, close quote. Elsewhere, Bill says Casey, quote, was supposed to be out of the hospital and reconsider this thing shortly after October 1st, close quote. But he later amended that date, noting that the judge was still ill and without his leadership, it was unlikely that the group of Washington businessmen would be able to, quote, consider the matter before October 15th, close quote. Even in early November, Bill was still, quote, most hopeful that Judge Casey and the Washington businessmen will presently come forward with a proposal, close quote, on the sanitarium, claiming he had, quote, the strongest kind of feeling that this is going to happen, close quote. It never did. Whatever might have been going on with Judge Casey and with his friends, part of the problem seems to have been Fitz Mayo, who, for some unknown reason, developed a strong aversion to the entire project. In the 3rd week of September, Fitz wrote Bill a letter detailing his many financial woes, offering several possible solutions. But while doing so, he, quote, expressed his reluctance to again approach the judge, end quote. Wilson doesn't elaborate on why Mayo was so reluctant to pursue this seemingly golden opportunity, but a few weeks later he did report his reaction to Fitz's wife Elizabeth, saying, quote, this annoyed me a little bit, for it looks to me like the judge is the sole prospect at the moment for a regular income, to say nothing of the general desirability of getting someplace with the work in Washington. The situation over there seems so obviously the best bet from every standpoint that I wrote Fitz a pretty stiff letter designed to dynamite him into action. On rereading it, I can see how I have possibly discouraged him from looking elsewhere, though to nothing like the degree that he seems to have conveyed to you. It was the most intelligent letter I know how to make, to keep him steered down the middle of the road in the direction of immediate bread and butter. If you think best, I shall write him correcting any impression that he should hold back on looking for anything that will produce results." End quote. Fitz, with Wilson's approval, finally decided to begin, quote, "doing some alcoholic work in Washington immediately, even if it be only on a shoestring." Bill thought this was a worthwhile plan because he felt, quote, "it will spur Judge Casey and his friend to do something all the sooner," quote, "and it would also, quote, build a fire under the foundation trustees if I can indicate that Fitz is actually at work in Washington," end quote.
Neither of these things happened. No money was ever raised in Washington, D.C., and the possibility of opening the first AA sanitarium there became less and less a topic of discussion among the Eastern leadership as the year drew to a close, and the plan finally fell out of sight completely as renewed work on the book began to demand more and more of everyone's time and attention. Bill Wilson was deeply attached to his dream of establishing a chain of AA hospitals, and it would take more than just this abject failure in Washington to kill it. Despite the fact that he had wasted the better part of a month on the project, Bill would continue to believe that a chain of sanitariums, sponsored and staffed by AA members, would eventually prove to be their best hope for carrying the message of recovery out into the greater world. It was a dream he would cling to for several more years before abandoning it completely.
Wonderful stuff. Chapter 12, The Alcoholic Foundation, August 1938. Let's hear it for the chapter and our readers. Wonderful stuff, guys.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Bill.
Very good. Excellent.
Great
Jim, we
job,
actually
David.
figured it out. Good job.
Yeah, I
Thank you
had a
so
little
much.
glitch there in the beginning, but
Well
yeah.
done.
You guys did great.
Again,
Thank
I have to emphasize there's no rehearsing involved here. It's just incredible, isn't it?
Good.
Thank you, everybody.
Well
I would
done.
get so into this.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Samantha.
David.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying I'd get so into the story I'd forget my part.
Yes, I did too. I think Gigi did as well today.
Oh,
Gigi,
she had mute problems.
it is. You'd want to know more, wouldn't you? Let's go to Mr. Sherberg and Bill, the author, Bill Sherberg.
Thank you, David. Couple of things. First of all, you know, they've got non-alcoholics in the majority in the first session here with the trustees. That gets changed in the 40s sometimes. I'm not good on the 40s dates, but I know that Wilson finally changes it so that the ex-alcoholics, as they say here, the ex-alcoholics are in charge. They've got the majority of the votes, and it's stayed that way ever since. So that was, one of those things that they thought it was really important to have that in the beginning because people would say, good Lord, you guys were in the gutter just 6 months ago or 2 years ago, and I'm going to trust you with how much money do you want? That kind of deal. So that was just one of the things I thought was really interesting. The other thing that's just become a bit more clear to me lately is this whole Henry Ford thing. Our friend Kenji, every time we get this Henry Ford mentioned, he bristles because Ford was a rabid anti-Semite. He was a rabid anti-Semite. And Kenji's point always is that if in fact Ford had written this thing, we'd be stuck with it. We would be stuck with this guy right up prominently in front of our book, whose reputation has just gone downhill over the years. There's a new novel out called Crucible that I just finished reading a week ago, and it's about Henry Ford. There's the Michigan story chain going with a whole bunch of different characters, and then he was trying to get a rubber tree plantation going in Brazil, and so it goes back and forth between Brazil and Michigan. But I got to tell you, I was just appalled by. Henry Ford wasn't just a rabid Semite. He was a borderline, if not a close to a card-carrying Nazi. he was just anti-union beyond belief. And you know, I mean, I finished this book and I thought this guy was a monster. A monster. So maybe the author of this thing was being unfair to him, but I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think he was doing an accurate portrayal of what a miserable, controlling son of a bitch Henry Ford was, you know, and I kind of enjoyed the book. It wasn't the best novel I ever read, but it was, you know, it's called Crucible, and it's brand new. And you know, one of the things that happened, you know, you see so he was anti-union. I mean, you wouldn't. I mean, if I've got the national, they had just set up the National Labor Relations Board or whatever it was under Franklin D. Roosevelt's tutelage, and they were forcing him to. They were forcing him to acknowledge the union, and he was like, if I got to sign a paper to do that, I'm closing the goddamn plant down. Just like he said here that if they, you know, if they bring prohibition back, I'm not making any more cars for those drunks. That's just stupid. So, but they did in fact finally get in there. But one of the things that appalled me, and it just, I think so much about the media attention since then and then going on at the moment was, you know, he controlled so much of the press that the stories they told very, very prominently and throughout radio and television. I mean, not television, but the press was that, you know, all these guys were communists. All these union guys were communists. If you just breathed a single positive word about the union, you got fired. And he had spies going around all the time doing this. I mean, it says here that if they come in your house and they find booze in your house, you get fired. You know, it was. And when I read that and I wrote this for the book, I was like, well, that's really weird. That's really sucko, you know, but it was way worse than that. If the stuff I'm reading here is correct. So, man, oh man, he was really, I think monster is the right word. That was certainly my takeaway. And I was like, big exhale. We in my house, we say exhala, you know, it's like exhale because exhala, baby, because if we had Henry Ford up front there, we'd be in some serious trouble here today. It's bad enough we got to defend two wives, for God's sakes, but defending Henry Ford would be absolutely impossible. Impossible. So anyhow, those are and then, you know, I can, you know, this thing about going on and on about how people demonize people who are trying to change things. You know, I can remember my father in probably the early 1960s showing me something he had gotten someplace or found someplace that claimed that Martin Luther King was a communist, and it showed him in the front row of some classroom that was being run by the Communist Party, you know, and it was just, you know, because MLK was all about change and people didn't want change, so they would smear him with all kinds of really, really bad things. And God knows who knows what's really going on in Washington these days. I mean, who the hell knows? I don't know. Anyhow, but I was really, really happy that Henry Ford turned out to be a no-show in this whole story here. You know, just like, okay.
Oh, great stuff, Bill. And let's go to Jim Worley. Jim.
To get back up on the same soapbox, I agree. We really dodged a bullet there. We dodged a couple bullets. You know, Henry Ford, you know, had some publications out, rabidly anti-Semitic publications out. Henry Ford is the only person that the author of Mein Kampf quoted in his book. Hitler quoted Ford in Mein Kampf. Ford was given an award by the Nazis, and as was his good friend Frank Buchmann, Ford's good friend. And that's another, you know, the time that New York broke with the Oxford Group was just shortly after Buchmann made his famous, you know, if misunderstood, who knows, but, you know, his famous statement, semi-praising Hitler. And, so Bill rapidly distancing AA and the Big Book from the Oxford group was another way to also distance us from that kind of those kind of people that history has proven to be not favorable to us, and so that is really important. I think that just one of those lucky coincidences of life that we dodge those bullets.
Well, just before we go to the Q&A here today, tomorrow you can continue this discussion. We can call it tomorrow. We're going to, on Sundays now at 8 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. We're going to have Writing the Big Book, the creation of a Reflections on Saturday reading meeting. We're going to call it a discussion meeting, and we can probably pick up on that tomorrow. Wow, that's powerful stuff, gents. If we got Bill, Bill, I think we have you for, I've got you 15, 20 minutes, I think. Yeah, thanks, Bill. And we've got Kit, one of our readers. Thank you, Kit. Kit is in Seattle.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you, David, for putting this all on. I've got a question that kind of piggybacks from yesterday's presentation as well. On page 234, we're talking about Wilson's reply to Dr. Bob and about the Akron people writing their stories and so forth. Didn't you say that in the first drafts of the Akron stories, they all were pretty much referring to Oxford Group? Oxford Group got me sober. Oxford Group this and that. And were those the things that were heavily edited out when they finally came to Bill?
We've got no. We've got 6 stories up in the Stepping Stones archive that came in after the Multilith copy was printed, and they're edited by Hank Parkhurst. I mean, it's just amazing all the stuff he's striking out of there. They do in fact talk about religion, and they do talk about God, but they don't mention the Oxford Group, and they don't mention Oxford Group practices as such. They don't say quiet time. Hank's not taking out references to quiet time and things like that. There is one, the story by Marie Bray, the story of an alcoholic wife, very, very short story. He took something out of that, and I think now that I'm thinking about it, kind of implies Oxford Group stuff. It was getting a little close to that, so he took that out. But, that's what they were doing. And, obviously Bob, when Frank Amos comes out in February, he writes Bill and he says, I hope he got the idea that we're not really doing Oxford Group stuff here, which is like a little hard to believe. And even the guy who wrote one of the books said, that's just Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. He quotes that and then says, of course, that was just Bob was whistling past the cemetery kind of thing. It was just, of course, that's what he got. They were in an Oxford Group meeting, for God's sake. What else do you think? But they were all trying to distance themselves from they didn't want to get pigeonholed, which is perfectly understandable. I mean, it's not like, oh my God, these guys are horrible. The kind of thing, that when we got closer, as Jim just said, as we got closer to 1938, 1939, there was some real problems with any mention. But in 34, 35, 36, it was just, they were gung-ho first century Christians. It was Christian, and they read the New Testament, and, the Epistle of James was the most important thing in them, according to Ann Smith, and, blah, blah, that kind of stuff. So, no, I think, I'm sure that Bob said, look, you just can't be selling the OG program here when you're doing this, I don't think they would have let any of that in, because they knew it created the wrong impression. An impression they did not want to create. So, yeah.
I know you were talking about how different the meetings were like in New York versus Akron at the time when this letter was going out. So I was just wondering if they were even carrying that into their stories that they were writing. That's all.
I'm sure Bob said, look, don't use any of that OG cliches. Don't talk about, guidance. Don't talk about quiet time. Don't talk about, the 4 absolutes and, Otherwise, I mean, they're still talking about the 4 absolutes out in Ohio today, for God's sakes, I mean.
I know.
So, I mean, I knew all those guys out there were talking about the four absolutes when they were writing those stories, but the four absolutes don't show up in any of the stories at all. None.
All right. Thank you.
Well, just think about the molds that Hank Parker's don't pour into molds. Would that have something to do with that, Bill? You didn't want to be pigeonholed, you were saying. You didn't want to be put into a mold.
Yeah, well, that was he thought if you make it, I've recently said, David, that I thought when Bill Wilson finished working with others, he figured he was done. That was the program, and that was really soft. It was like, warm and fuzzy, and we do this and we do that and we do the other thing, and that's the deal. 12 steps, on the other hand, are like, first you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, And I think Hank really objected to that. He thought it was too much of a pouring people into a mold. Everybody's got a cookie. We have a cookie cutter solution. Here's our cookie cutter for you.
Great stuff, guys. Gigi, we're going from Seattle down to Oregon, or over to Oregon, I guess. Oregon, Gigi.
Straight down the coast.
Straight down the coast. Thank you, Gigi.
Hey everybody, Gigi Alcoholic, and wow, what a great chapter. I have 4 questions, but I'm only going to ask one. And it has to do with the failure of the DC sanitarium. So my question really is it Bill's impatience in trying to push Fitz into this? Is Fitz really resisting it because he's not cut out for sales work? Is that why he was so resistant to, it seems like Fitz kind of gave up too early, is my impression.
Well, it certainly sounds like that, but there's no details in the letter we've got. It's just, we don't have Fitz's letter. We've got Bill's letter talking about Fitz's letter. And so it's another one of those, God, wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall while that discussion is going on, so you knew what the hell they were really talking about. But no, I don't, it just doesn't make sense. I can't, a lot of times you get pieces of the puzzle and you can say, okay, this is how those pieces go together, and that makes sense to me. I don't have an easy solution to this. How come Fitz went south on the whole project? I can make up some BS story, but it would be based on nothing, just because there's no indication there that I can see about what was going on with Fitz, that he went south on the whole thing.
I'm just thinking he's mentioned as a lovable dreamer, and in Jim's presentation, I know that he didn't live too much longer either. So 7 years, 9 years. He didn't.
He died in 43, I think, on October 4th, 1943. No, not 43, because that's my birthday, October 4th, 1943. When did he die, Jim?
47.
Okay, 47.
47. But yeah, Gigi, you're right. When I did that presentation, I found out a lot of things that I hadn't known before. And he was not what you'd call a successful person. In business, he just didn't get things right. His family life was a mess. His romantic life, everything. He could never seem to get people sober. He was not just not a good businessman. You mentioned like salesman or something. He just wasn't. He wasn't one of those promoter types like A type like Bill and Hank and those people to go out and do those things. And he had a lot more failures, and he was a lovable dreamer. I think Lois said that, but he wasn't very effective with carrying the message or doing much of anything in his life.
Thank you.
But a nice guy.
Bill,
Bill just had wonderful things to say about it.
Yeah, just not cut out for evangelizing or promoting, or if it didn't happen right away and fall into place like that for him, he wasn't going to pursue it real hard like Bill would.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my impression. Thanks.
Thank you, G. Now I'm intrigued to know your other 3 questions, but we move on. What's Dina T, the big book Slayer, got for us?
Hey everybody, I'm Dean Alcoholic. Thank you so much again, Bill, for your awesome book. And what I have just a comment that just thinking about these 80 years, like my mother's in her early 80s, and so it's nice to think about that it all kind of started, that I've kind of been a part of all this time, you know. And then you talking about the guy, that your old sponsor that dated Hazard's granddaughter or whatever. Daughter, sorry. And so how all this stuff of the history of each person, and so it's so nice. But you know, because like say a year ago, I was pretty much thinking Bill sat down and he's like, I've got a moment, and he just sat down and he wrote the book, and then he went out and he got it sold, and then he like people do nowadays, they have it on TV. You want to write a book? I'll send it to here, you know. It was not easy. Good God, what a lot of work. And so I'm so glad you got that across. I'm so glad they all came together, and I'm not hammered right now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Susan is in Iceland.
Hi guys, Susan Alcoholic. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, David. Thank you all, the team. Yes, I concur with Dina. I'm really glad that things worked out the way that they did. Holy crap. I just wanted to reiterate what Kit was referring to from last night, was Bill, when you were referring to when Bill Wilson was interviewing the old timers for the AA Comes of Age. That was when those Akron members were referring to the Oxford group. Wasn't that correct? So that it wasn't during the compilation of the stories into the AA book. It was much later.
Right. So when Wilson was just interviewing them, and he recorded these interviews, he would ask them questions, and they would say, "Oh yeah, we were getting on our knees, and you couldn't go to the meeting unless you went upstairs." And it's all this stuff, but it didn't make it into the official publication. And I'm sure if any of that stuff had ended up in New York City as a potential story, that Hank Parkhurst would have axed it right out. It's amazing how much editing he did on those stories. What's his name? Myron Williams? I can't remember. He had a story about fear, and it was, the handwritten thing is 15 pages long, and Hank X'd out the first 7 pages. I mean, he was doing some serious editing, and I mean, and Bill Wilson says that the guys in New York were pissed because they had worked all hard on these stories. They had these wonderful stories, and all of a sudden Hank's whacking the whole thing out and doing something different with it. So anyhow, hang on a second. What do we got? Hang on. Did somebody just post something about
Thomas? Put it into the chat, Bill. Thomas Nice. Do you want me to read it?
See, he did die on my birthday. Okay.
Jimmy? Is that correct, Jeff? Tom put into the chat that he was born in Fitzhugh was born on July 31st, 1897, and he said he's died on October 4th, 1943.
43.
That's what we have at the moment in the chat. Tom, what's your source for that?
Yeah, 7, 8 years, yeah.
I was just looking at Fitz's gravestone.
Gravestone, okay.
That's a good one then. Good, thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, you were right, Bill. I was wrong.
Well, no, I was wrong. No, that has to be a second. Sorry, Jim. You're up there, just beneath Mr. Sherberg.
I remember the first time I noticed that, I thought, oh, maybe I do believe in reincarnation.
Wow. Well, that'd be a complete contrast. Yeah, I can see the contrast there.
Only an egomaniac, go for it.
Let's keep going, and we got Samantha's in Hawaii. We're going around now.
Hi everybody, I am in Hawaii. It's a beautiful day. Thank you everyone. Thank you again. What a great job. Thank you, Bill, for writing the book. Thank you to all the people digging around in history and bringing it to us. My depth of gratitude continues to deepen through history, realizing, as a couple have already said, that it just wasn't the white light, write a book, get it out, here we are, thank God for AA, that it's incredible. what went into getting it out that we have what we do today. And I love your humor through the book too, Bill. Thanks for that. I really enjoy it. And things are so synchronistic. This thing about Henry Ford, and this has been happening a lot lately. There's a speaker choosing a reading for a meeting tomorrow, and it starts off with Henry Ford. That's what his quote starts off with. And how, I don't know, it just hit me heavy that. So it's still in our book. And yeah, it all works together for greatest good, that things sifted out the way they needed to keep this pure singleness of purpose of AA to not be affiliated and all the traditions. And that quote about how do a group of erstwhile alcoholics get along together, I mean, that in itself is a miracle. It's all a miracle. I'm so grateful to be here and be in recovery and sitting with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you, Samantha. Because I love his quote. Experience is the thing of supreme value. I just love that quote in the big book. So I'm into the message rather than the messenger, I guess. But that's a great principle. The experience is the thing of supreme value, only if it's used to good account. So if I think that's it, Bill. I think we're closing shop for today. But
Good. Sarah's got dinner ready.
Hello, Sarah. If you can hear us, nice. Sarah, why have you got? No. Bill, you're going to close for us in your usual way. I think you are. I'm going to put up on the screen for us. So thank you, everyone. We're back tomorrow. If you want to jump in, please do. But we're here next week. We're doing chapter 13, and we'll see you then for that. What are we on? What's the title of next week's? More about alcoholism, is it? And we agnostics? What are we reading next week? No, it's not. It's titled This Week Magazine, and we're in September to October 1938. There you go. So Bill Shaberg, we're going back to you to close for. Thank you, Bill. I hope I never get tired of saying that, by the way. Wonderful stuff. There you go, Bill.
Thank you, David. I'd like to close with the evening, Goth, and I just want to reiterate, this is for me. It's not for you. It's so, forgive me if I personalize it. Let me respectfully remind you, William, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunity is lost. Each of us should strive to awaken to the present moment. Take heed. Tonight, your days are diminished by one. Do not squander your life.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, David. Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you next Friday and next Saturday.
Bill is back with us next Friday. We have Bill again next Friday. Next
Looking
Saturday.
forward. See you tomorrow.
David's got me for 4 the 18.
I know. I'm delighted. Like Christmas. It's great stuff. I love it.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah, I know. Let's stop the recording, and let's just pause it for now.